We have everything in Brazil to become like the Premier League. We have the passion, the talent, the fan base, and the potential for growth, said Daniel Vorcado, the president of a Brazilian bank that co-owns Atlético Mineiro, one of the biggest clubs in Brazil. A lot has changed over the past few years when it comes to Brazilian clubs, from loads of money being injected into them and a complete dominance of South American soccer. So can the Brazilian league, known as the Brasileirão, become the new Premier League? Is that possible, or is it complete nonsense? It is already what I would call the Premier League of CONMEBOL, except for the fact that Brazilian clubs actually dominate the region far more than English clubs dominate Europe. I would even argue that English clubs don't dominate Europe. And before you start overreacting and calling me delusional and a hater of the Premier League, which I most certainly am not, you're gonna want to hear me out, because I am known as the soccer Nostradamus, which means most of the things I predict do happen. And we're gonna dive into the Premier League, the Brazilian League, and much more throughout this video, so calm down your nerves. Hello, if you're new here, I'm Filippo, and welcome to Chapéu Football, where we mainly cover Brazilian football, or soccer, I don't judge what you call it, and South America as well. The Brazilian league is changing rapidly. The finances of the clubs have never been this strong, and we have never seen them dominate South American soccer as they currently have. And I'm not saying that it's going to become bigger, better, and richer than the English Premier League. That is very unlikely, at least in the short run. I don't see it happening. We're going to talk about that throughout the video. But today I want to go through what's happening right now in the Brazilian league. The league has been growing at a tremendous rate. And besides the Brazilians and South Americans, no one else seems to care. No one else seems to even be talking about it. So I'm going to give you my opinions throughout the video and present a lot of facts and data that you might care about. And you're going to want to pay attention because there's a ton of information that will drop. Okay, so before we start, make sure to drop a like in this video if you enjoy this type of content, and subscribe because we will be ramping up the amount of videos and live streams throughout 2025. With that said, let's begin. Okay, but before we start talking about what's happening in Brazil, we must talk about the English Premier League, because it's kind of important. And why don't we start with a fact? The English Premier League is the richest soccer league in the world. The clubs collectively generate more than 7 billion euros annually, which also makes the Premier League the fourth richest sports league in the world, only behind the NFL, NBA, and MLB, Major League Baseball. These are all facts. Now, in my opinion, and I know this is a popular opinion, but not everyone agrees, the Premier League is the most competitive domestic soccer league in the world. Because you see, the top teams in La Liga, the Bundesliga, Serie A, they can compete with the top Premier League teams, and some of them even beat them, like Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich. But the mid-table and relegation battle teams in the Premier League are far superior to those in all other top 5 leagues in Europe, in my opinion. So again, sure, Real Madrid can go there and win the Premier League. Still, the Premier League is the most competitive league in the world, in my opinion. Now, you may be wondering, what does this have to do with the Brasileirão? Hold your horses, we're gonna get there in a second. So here's the thing, the English Premier League was not always the best soccer league in the world. Back in the 60s, where players moving abroad wasn't really a thing and you couldn't really watch every single league in the world, many football historians claim that the Brazilian league was the strongest one back then. And the success of the Brazilian national team by winning 3 out of 4 World Cups from 1958 to 1970 and pretty much having all their players playing in Brazil is a strong evidence of that. Along with the fact that Pelé Santos was an unstoppable force back then, even when they were facing the top European teams. Now, if you go back to the 80s or even the 90s, the Italian Serie A was probably the most popular soccer league in the world, and most certainly the strongest one. My point here is that it goes by cycles, and different leagues become the best leagues in the world during different eras. Things change, and the Brazilian league is changing rapidly. But wait, I still have to talk about the Premier League just a little bit more, and then we're gonna dive into Brazil. So the Premier League was founded back in February 20th of 1992, and it was created to increase the economic potential of English football. So the clubs that were from Football League First Division broke away from the Football League to create the English Premier League with the support of the FA. And that led to increased revenue, which allowed the English clubs to sign better players and improve their product on the field, youth development, and much more. They also targeted a global audience, which worked, and as the years went by, the English Premier League became much bigger worldwide. And that was a very smart move because they knew back then that they couldn't really grow much more domestically. They've peaked in England. Becoming the #1 soccer league in the United States of America in terms of audience also played a big role, along with great marketing and social media growth. All of that led to great broadcasting deals, better sponsorships, jersey sales, and much more. And of course, England already had a very strong football culture and rich history, because it's not just about pouring money into it and restructuring your leagues. The Saudi League and MLS can pour as much money as they want, but you still need the historic elements and the cultural elements to make it explode, right? You can keep pouring as much money as you want. It doesn't mean you're going to become the #1 league in the world. It takes time. So the Prem started to become more and more popular globally in the 2000s, but in the 2010s, it's when it really took off in popularity from a global standpoint. So I'd say it took nearly 20 years after the implementation of the English Premier League for this already massive league to become the #1 in the world in terms of popularity. So, can the Brazilian League take down the Premier League? And in my honest opinion, no. That's not going to happen for multiple reasons. However, I will say this, the Brazilian League could get close over the long run to the Premier League and definitely surpass a few of the top 5 leagues in Europe. Back in 2023, the Brasileirão had its clubs generate a revenue of roughly 1.7 billion euros. And trust me, it's much larger now. It continues to grow, which is still quite far from the English Premier League. However, it's not that far from Ligue 1, the French league, which is around 2.3 billion euros. But the rate of growth of the Brazilian league is far larger than the big European leagues. From 2022 to 2023, the Brazilian league grew roughly 30% of its revenue, that 1.7 billion that I just mentioned. Now, during that same time, Ligue 1, that generated 2.3, they grew only 17%, which is half the rate of what the Brazilian club's revenue was growing. Which now reaches the point of the video where we're going to talk about the Brazilian league. Why is it growing so fast? Has it not peaked domestically? Clearly not, because it's not really growing globally, at least in terms of its audience. It really isn't. So what is going on in Brazil, and why is the league so rich right now, and why does it still have a ton of potential to grow? But before we talk about Brazil, make sure to drop a like in this video if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for that. So reason number 1 is the SAF. And SAF is S-A-H, but in Brazil, they call it SAF. Let me explain. Okay, so SAF was actually passed through law back in 2021. Prior to that, the Brazilian clubs were all non-profit clubs owned by the members, known as the sócios. Then each club would have a president that would be elected, a board. I'm not going to be diving into the details there because it's not very important for this specific video. However, after the SAF was introduced, these non-profit clubs were allowed to essentially become a new type of public limited company. In other words, it allowed Brazilian clubs to have private ownership and have a club managed for profit, which led to more investors coming into Brazilian football. You know, some of them even from Brazil, like Ronaldo Phenomenon, R9, at some point he was the owner of Cruzeiro. We also got plenty of foreign investors, like the American John Textor that currently owns Botafogo. Okay, so essentially these clubs were non-profits, and with the SAF being introduced, they were allowed to become actual companies for profit. So this didn't only inject more money into the clubs via investors, but it also helped these clubs improve their financial management and governance and ended some of the corruption. Now look, the private ownership of these clubs did help, in fact, reduce internal corruption among, former crooks that were running some of these clubs. And I'm not saying that private ownership will end all corruption. I don't think anything truly ends corruption, especially in Brazil. But having an owner behind a club will make it far tougher to suck away the money that that club has through sketchy deals, which I also won't dive into details because it's beyond the point I'm trying to make in this video. And I also don't want to name names because we're not trying to get a lawsuit against us here. We're a tiny channel. So the SAF increased investment into soccer in Brazil and improved the management and financial conditions of many clubs that have adopted it so far. At the time of this recording, we have over 60 SAF clubs in Brazil, the most notable ones being Atlético Mineiro, that even made it to a Libertadores final recently, Bahia, that is owned by Citigroup, Botafogo, that just recently won the Brazilian League and the Copa Libertadores, Cruzeiro, Cuiabá, Fortaleza, and the Rio de Janeiro Giants Vasco da Gama. But trust me, there are far more to come in the next few years. Reason number 2 is that now the Brazilian clubs are being able to maximize the Brazilian football domestic market. And you may be wondering, why were they not doing that prior? I mean, it's not like soccer is getting more popular in Brazil. That's nearly impossible. It's huge in that country, the most popular sport in Brazil. The problem is, soccer in Brazil is mostly run by imbeciles. But with the SAF and the professionalism that's coming into the country recently, that has improved drastically. So over the past few years, not only due to SAF, Brazilian clubs have been able to maximize its domestic market in many ways. One being through club memberships, which fans can sign up by paying a monthly fee where they would get multiple perks that come with it. But one of the ways the clubs have been able to maximize it far more, for the better or for the worse, is with sports betting companies. And there have been multiple reports that show that sports betting has increased over 400% in Brazil since 2020, maybe even more. And it shows. In the 2024 season, 15 out of the 20 clubs in the first division had a betting company sponsor them. Most recently, the Palmeiras Giants Palmeiras, they left Crefisa, that was their main sponsor for multiple years, that was paying them around 81 million reais per year, with bonuses allowing it to hit 120 million reais. But the new deal that they got with Sporting Bet, a betting sponsor, will pay Palmeiras 100 million reais per year fixed. And with the bonuses, it can hit up to 170 million reais. That is over a 25% increase year over year. That is huge. Now, there are social concerns in regards to the massive growth of gambling in Brazil, which is fair in my opinion. But one thing is for sure, the soccer clubs are profiting a lot out of these sponsorship deals. I mean, think about it this way. Abel Ferreira, the current coach of Palmeiras, he makes more money than Sahim, the current coach of Borussia Dortmund. He also makes more money than the current coach of Chelsea. So as I said, I'm not saying the Palmeiras team or any Brazilian team has more money than Chelsea or Dortmund, but this just comes to show that they have a ton of money. And that's just one of many examples. Okay, we're off to reason number 3, and there's only 2 more to go. There's gonna be 4 reasons total. But reason number 3 is not a reason why Brazilian soccer is taking off and making so much money. It's actually a reason why it has still a lot of potential to grow. And I'll explain that in a second, but I want to dive into one thing real quick so you can see how rich this league is right now and why I called it the Premier League of CONMEBOL, or the Premier League of South America. The Brazilian league is actually very lucrative right now for South American standards. For context, Vélez, they won the Argentine league back in 2024, and they got $500,000 as a check or their reward for winning the league. Now, Red Bull Bragantino, or Red Bull Bragantino, was the first team out of the relegation zone in Brazil, and they got paid somewhere between $2.5 to $3 million for finishing in that position, which is more than 5 times what the Argentine champions got paid. Let that sink for a second. The winners of the Argentine League, which is the second richest league in South America and the second best league in South America, they got paid $500,000. Now, the first team out of the relegation zone in Brazil got paid roughly $2.5 to $3 million. That is 5 times what the Argentine champions made. That's essentially as if Real Madrid won La Liga and Southampton finished in 16th in the Premier League and they made 5 times the amount of money that Real Madrid made for that. It's insane. But it gets worse, because Santos, that won the second division of Brazil in 2024, they made more money than Vélez, the Argentine champions. That's as if the EFL championship winner made more money than La Liga's winner or the Bundesliga winner. It's insane. But what if I told you the Brazilian league could pay their clubs a lot more for the years to come? And not only could, they will. However, for that, they would have to do something similar to what the Premier League did in the 90s when it was created. They restructured English football, and that's what the Brazilian clubs want to do. The only issue was the Premier League had the FA to back it, while the Brazilian league doesn't really have, or actually not the Brazilian league, but the Brazilian clubs don't really have the federation to back them. Currently, the Brasileirão is controlled by CBF. Now, the clubs don't want to get rid of CBF, and they can't get rid of CBF by any means. But they wanted a complete restructure of Brazilian football a few years ago, and they still do, where the clubs would have far more control over the league, fixing the calendar, making money distribution more fair, more even, just improving everything, which would be very much needed, and if done right, would work wonders for the clubs. And notice how I said if done right, because it wasn't one or two steps that made the Premier League what it is today, right? It was a ton of steps, some small, some huge, over multiple years. It's not like do one step and you're fine. It has to be a lot of right steps throughout multiple years. Now keep in mind that CBF has FIFA to protect them, so the clubs can only do any of this if the federation supports it. They can't just go on their own and create the new league and just completely detach themselves from the federation, which makes this entire process tough with so many people negotiating and different interests. And once again, that's what makes it tricky, because when the Premier League was created, the FA supported it. Now, the Brazilian clubs would like to do something similar to that, but CBF won't support that. So look, it won't be perfect. Nothing ever is in Brazil. But I think for the years to come, the clubs will gain more and more leverage, and private ownership will put more pressure on CBF, and things will change. Over time, I think it will be more favorable conditions. There will be more favorable conditions for the clubs, and they will make more money through the Brasileirão. It'll be slow and it'll take time, but it just comes to show you how this league or all these clubs, they still have a lot of room to grow their revenue. Essentially, they haven't really peaked domestically yet. Reason number 4 is that the Brazilian league has been dominating its region. And the more you win your regional tournament, right, the Copa Libertadores, which is the Champions League of South America, the more money you make, the more the fans get excited, the more jerseys you sell, the more sponsorships you sell. Everything gets better when you're winning trophies. But the thing is, it's not one or two clubs dominating South America. It's the league. So in terms of dominating the region, it's been happening for quite some time, and obviously that brings more revenue for all the clubs. Brazilian clubs won the past 6 Libertadores. That's as if the Premier League had won 6 consecutive Champions Leagues, which I don't think that ever happened. The closest we ever seen that in Europe, at least in recent years, was with La Liga in the 2010s with Real Madrid and Barcelona. But that's only 2 clubs dominating the Champions League. And I think out of those 5, Real Madrid won 4 of them. Brazil, it's actually the league. Throughout these 6 years, the Brazilian league had 4 different champions in the Copa Libertadores and 7 different finalists. That is complete dominance. I think the only other country that dominates their region this way would be like Mexico and CONCACAF a few years ago, right? At least the Mexican clubs, they still mostly dominate CONCACAF. But the next big step and the big challenge for the Brazilian league is to grow globally. And that's where the Premier League succeeded. And that's where I think the Brazilian league will fail, if they even try. But you know, if Brazil really tried to reach a global audience, they do have the tools. The clubs have a rich history. They have crazy rivalries, great prospects, legendary players, and a very competitive league. It's all about marketing, increased exposure, telling the stories to the world. Now, will it happen? It's unlikely. Out of everything I mentioned in this video, this is the least likely to happen for now. I mean, think about it. The Brazilian clubs, they don't seem to care about that, and it's been a mess over the past few years. I think they were not even in the last EAFC video game. How can you grow globally if you can't even put your teams in the freaking video game where kids are playing it all over the globe? Essentially what I'm saying is they suck at marketing, and trust me, they really do. This is where the Premier League succeeded like no other domestic league has ever done in the history of the sport. And I do not see the Brazilian league getting anywhere near what the Premier League has done in terms of its global reach, at least not anywhere in the near future. Okay, so what are my final thoughts on this topic? First and foremost, I don't think the Brazilian league will ever reach the level of the Premier League from a financial or global outreach standpoint in my lifetime. 200 years from now, 100 years from now, who knows? But in the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years, I doubt it. It's very unlikely unless something extreme happens. Now, in regards to the issues, the Brazilian economy is a problem, corruption, and the region, right? The region is not strong and will not keep up with the growth of the Brazilian league, which will hold it back, just like Mexico was held back for years in CONCACAF, at least the clubs were. The Brazilian league teams also will not have the Champions League, which is something that the Premier League clubs do have, which helps increase their revenue. It helps also increase their global outreach. So that to me won't happen. But could the Brazilian league in the next few years surpass the French league in terms of revenue? Yes, it most certainly can. You already saw it throughout the video. It's very close. Could it surpass another of the top 5 leagues? Yes, I think the Brazilian league, with everything I said, if it continues to grow, it can possibly become a top 3 league in the world. I think the future is bright. The clubs are richer than ever, the quality is high, but no, I don't see Brazil becoming a global force like the English Premier League. They will continue to dominate South America like they currently do, and they will very likely become a top 5 league very soon, possibly a top 3 league within the next 10 to 20 years if things go right. And yeah, the Brazilian currency is another issue that I'd like to address. That's another problem that affects the league quite a bit because it makes it much tougher for them to hold on to their world-class prospects. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to drop a like before you go. Make sure you subscribe to Chapéu Football. We're going to continue to ramp up the content throughout 2025 and do plenty of live streams. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day.